Welcome to SinoWarfare with Ralph D. Sawyer.
Before we start studying certain spring and autumn battles, some sense of how we even know anything about this ancient era might be appropriate. First, and most reliably, the archaeological discoveries that permit reconstructing the material aspects of history, including weapons and battlegrounds, sometimes turn up bronze vessels with inscriptions that commemorate key events. Excavations have also yielded tens of thousands of important artifacts over recent decades, including Guoju's famous sword, which we'll look at later. However, despite their fragmentary and compressed nature, only the era's historical records allow reconstructing the flow of events. The Spring and Autumn Annals, supposedly edited by Confucius himself, chronicles the era's political events and military actions. It encompasses developments in the state of Lu and any official reports that they received, mostly cursive and often cryptic. For example, the 9 entries for 707 BC, the year Zhou and Jung clashed at Xuge, which we will discuss shortly, record the burial of Qin's ruler, the walling of a city, a sacrifice for rain, and the appearance of locusts. The entry for the battle, Xuge, simply states, "In autumn, the men of Cai, the men of Wei, and the men of Chen followed the king in attacking Zheng." Of course, by men it means their respective armies. And notice, nothing is said about the outcome. Being written from Lu's perspective, the Spring and Autumn Annals not only has an innate bias, it's an incomplete record of the realm's activities. The Bamboo Annals, a similar chronicle from the state of Wei, supplements it to some extent. However, the real source for the period is the massive work known as the Zhou or Zhou's commentary. Probably composed sometime in the Warring States period, it's one of 3 commentaries on the spring and autumn events, though scholarly opinion on its origin and reliability varies. All 3 of them increase the range of events, but only the Zhou contains extensive narrative, historical expansion, and effusive dialogue. Overall, it unfolds a remarkable tale of intrigue, licentiousness, assassination, and warfare. One other work, the Guoyu, or Conversations of the States, purportedly depicts spring and autumn events, with an emphasis upon dialogue. Just like the Zhou, it retells a number of florid events, but having been compiled in the Han Dynasty from unknown materials, it's even more questionable. In aggregate, contrary to any impression that the spring and autumn was a tranquil age marked by righteousness and ritual, it was pervaded by ambition, greed, power politics, and hypocrisy. Vestiges of ritual and chivalry might still be seen on the battlefield, but behind the glorified accounts of knightly behavior lay the pain and the carnage of combat. Moreover, Zhou authority had become a mere figment, something to be acknowledged when useful, but otherwise ignored. The modes of conflict range from raids and minor incursions to more substantial attacks that annihilated states and resulted in their annexation.
Early on, Jin, Qi, and Zheng were powerful, but ever-strengthening Chu quickly became entangled in a 100-year rivalry with Jin as it tried to push into the heartland. Caught between the major powers, the pivotal states of Zheng and later Song, Chen, Cai, and Wei suffered coercion and invasion. As time passed, Zheng, Lu, and Song weakened further. Then newly ascendant Wu and Chu became embroiled in conflict near the end of the period. The spring and autumn finally ended when Yue vanquished Wu. It was an era of shifting alliances, usually with 2 or 3 smaller states acting under the patronage of a major player.
Although the Zhou is known for 5 great battles, it's more for its vivid depiction of the personnel and ancillary events than the battles themselves. In fact, the epoch-making clash at Changzhuo, which we will discuss next time, is the only one with any useful tactical description. Fortunately, several other battles are sufficiently well documented to allow reconstructing the tactics in some detail. These include 2 famous clashes between Wu and Shu, Jifu and Boju, and the assault that sealed Wu's fate, the Battle of the Lize River. All three are extensively discussed in the introduction to my Art of War translation, and will be revisited later in the context of unorthodox warfare. Feigned retreats, which will also be the subject of a separate talk, appear to have been employed in both China and the West ever since organized warfare began. They were primarily used to lure well-placed, often superior enemies out of position, so that they might be ambushed or engaged on more favorable terrain. However, it should be remembered that all movement, whether voluntary or compelled, tends to induce disorder, making the forces vulnerable to attack, just as the debacle at Fei River well attests. The term feign is also somewhat misleading because the tactic usually entails an actual withdrawal rather than just posturing. This can dishearten the troops if they are unaware of the commander's intent. Nevertheless, over the centuries, feigned retreats brought about a number of spectacular battlefield reversals. In China, the tactic's first recorded use dates to 714 BC, when it was adopted to thwart ongoing incursions by steppe peoples generally termed barbarians in Chinese thought and records. The Zhou preserves a lucid characterization, one that would frequently be cited as subsequent military and court discussions. It's a bit lengthy, but let me quote. When the Northern Rong mounted an incursion into the state of Jung, the Duke of Zheng actively resisted them. However, he was troubled by the Rong army because, as he says, it is composed of infantry, whereas we are on chariots. I'm afraid that they will maneuver around behind us and launch a sudden attack. Prince Tu suggested, we should have some courageous but irresolute men provoke the invaders and then quickly flee. Meanwhile, you should establish 3 ambushes to await them. And here comes the characterization. The Rong act hastily and are not well ordered. They are greedy and lack close feelings. In victory, they will not yield to each other. In defeat, they will not rescue each other. When those in the forefront see potential gain, they'll concentrate on advancing. When they advance and encounter our ambushes, they are sure to speedily run off. Since those at the rear won't rescue them, they won't sustain the conflict, resolving our difficulty. The ploy's highly successful execution made the tactic an option for later commanders and provided an early example of how to conceive and employ unorthodox measures. Although not the first battle recorded in the spring and autumn annals, the battle at Xuge is historically significant because the rebellious state of Jung defeated a coalition of feudal states commanded by the Zhou king himself. Provoked by a long-standing conflict over town siegers, and angered at having been dismissed from his role as one of the 2 powerful ministers in the central Zhou government, the Duke of Zheng had ceased attending court. Believing this to be an insufferable instance of disrespect, the king initiated a punitive campaign, which the Duke of Zheng immediately prepared to resist. Apart from the political ramifications of a subject daring to strike the king's own clan forces, the only time in the spring and autumn that the king of the Zhou actually commanded in person, the battle is noteworthy for the strategic acumen displayed by a Zheng strategist. He said, Chen's forces are disordered. None of their people have a will to fight. If we assault them first, they will certainly run off. When the king's troops see that, they will become disordered. The contingents from Cai and Wei won't sustain them, but instead flee. Once that happens, we can concentrate our forces upon the king's troops and achieve our objective. Zheng thus satisfied Sun's subsequent admonition to know the enemy. The battle unfolded just as scripted. The king was wounded by an arrow, but he was spared further harm so as not to further humiliate him and to severely contravene an antique order that still enjoyed varying degrees of respect, not to mention avoid antagonizing the other feudal lords. especially as Jung hoped to achieve recognition as the realm's dominant power, which it did for a short time. Nevertheless, long before the Battle of Changzhuo and Sunzi's articulation of Qi's importance, we can see strategists were deliberately targeting enemy's weakness, in this case the soldiers who lacked the spirit required for combat, just as the art of war advises. This class coincidentally raises the immensely complex question of whether it's operationally better to initially target the weakest components or the strongest, generally known as the enemy's center of gravity. Here, it was felt that with their support stripped away, the center would be isolated and vulnerable. Zheng's strategists made another significant adjustment. They increased the density of their assault forces. This was accomplished by deploying the troops on the flanks in closely packed square formations. There's no suggestion they employed just infantry, which would be unlikely because the squads were tied to the chariots. However, they seem to have replaced the usual somewhat open chariot-centered formations with a much tighter block whose sheer weight could overwhelm a disordered opponent. Adjustments were similarly made to the center force, though the description, first the contingent, then the fives, like fish tied together, has prompted considerable disagreement over the centuries. Again, it clearly refers to increasing the density and eliminating any gaps, possibly by going back to having contingents of chariots operating without attached infantry. In that case, the chariots would have massed at the front, with the infantry, the fives, behind them. Whatever the actuality, we should remember chariots were still the vehicles of aristocrats, of men who tended to fight as warriors, largely for individual glory. Furthermore, as we'll discuss in the talks on chariots, and as I concluded in the analysis presented in Ancient Chinese Warfare after experimenting with fighters and static mock-ups, chariot combat was primarily archery-based because the era's shock weapons were too short for the combatants' blades to reach each other. Our next talk will be devoted to the epic-making Battle of Chengpu. Meanwhile, thank you for watching.